Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. I hope you all had a good reading week. So this is the first in a set of three where we are looking at Ragnarok and its uses in our case study games. And for this first lecture we are going to be focusing on the story of Ragnarok itself in Norse mythology, just to establish a sort of baseline as to where the story came from, the basic shape of it, and to review some context from your tutorial readings. All right, so the most detailed presentation of Ragnarok, plus likely the earliest we have, is the Voluspa, of course. And its description of the end of the world takes up perhaps 30 of the poem's 66 stanzas, depending on when you claim that it starts. Snorri's account in the Prose Edda is a paraphrase of the Voluspa's account, plus some additional details, mostly just embroidery that he added. May have been his own invention, may have been from other works that we no longer have. Mostly what he added focuses on the rebirth section of the story. Now, in terms of other literary sources, we do see references to the concept of Ragnarok in various other poems, including the Skaldic poems, Eriksmal and Hakornamal. It's enough to tell us that the concept of Ragnarok was active in Scandinavian culture during the 10th century, although they are just references. There's no sign that the poets considered the end of the world to be near. And that actually is worth mentioning because certainly in Southern Europe we do see millennial movements around that time, but of course it's only the millennium in the Christian calendar, and at that time Scandinavia is still more or less grappling with the concept of Christianity. Now, interestingly, we do also see the story of Ragnarok reflected in art, specifically images on runestones and on Scandinavian crosses as well. Yes, images of a pagan apocalypse on Christian crosses, because Christianization is not a straightforward process. So there are three major examples of a figure being depicted with his foot in the mouth of a beast. And the assumption is that this is probably Odin fighting Fenrir. One has his hand, however, on the beast's jaw instead. So is this possibly Vidar fighting Fenrir? So that's Odin's son who avenges him by ripping Fenrir's jaws apart. So I'll give you two examples of these artistic depictions. One is the 10th century Gosford cross. It also has other scenes, as well as the scene of Odin and Fenrir. And these other scenes seem to echo images from Ragnarok. There's also the Skarpakar stone from the 11th century. And it actually has an inscription that paraphrases, or seems to paraphrase, the Poetic Edda on Ragnarok. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through the basic story of Ragnarok, just to review it again, and this should provide some context for when we look at it in the context of our case study games. Now, as discussed in our lecture on the gods, Loki was of course responsible ultimately for bringing about Baldur's death by manipulating events. Baldur's death had been prophesied by a dead seeress, Frigg, Baldur's mother, protected him against everything but mistletoe, thinking that the plant was too young to hurt him. She happened to mention this to a woman who visited her in her hall, who just happened to be Loki in surprise. Baldur plays his stupid game of letting the gods throw things at him to test Frigg's protective magic, and wins his stupid prize when Hodor, his blind brother, is given a dart of mistletoe by an invisible Loki, and kills his brother with it. Loki also prevents Baldur's resurrection. Now, Hel's request, if you remember, had been that everything on Earth needed to weep for him if she was to let him go, but there was one giantess who refused, and so the condition wasn't fulfilled. And the giantess was Loki in disguise. Now, meanwhile, Odin, as part of the prophecy that he was given, knows that he needs to father a son to avenge Baldur. This son is specifically named in the prophecy as an avenger. So this is Vali. But according to Saxo Grammaticus, the circumstances of his conception were pretty awful. So Odin supposedly knows that the princess Rindir needed to be the mother of this prophesied avenger. So he infiltrates her father's household under the guise of a general and tries to kiss her. She slaps him. He pretends to be a metal worker who brings her beautiful bracelets and then tries to kiss her. She slaps him. And then he uses his magic runes to drive her mad. Disguises himself as a healer and prescribes a drink so awful that the princess has to be tied to the bed to force her to drink it. He is left alone with his patient, at which point he assaults her. Now, interestingly, this is a hideous story, but there are real consequences for Odin, according to Saxo. Saxo says that the other gods are so furious at this that they exiled him for a time. Now, Rindr still does give birth to the prophesied Avenger who kills Hodr. But again, Hodr is not the one really responsible. This just perpetuates the shedding of blood within the kin group, which is a way of unbalancing the world even further. You're not supposed to do that within your kin. If you're Scandinavian, that is specifically breaking the bonds of society, and it is exactly the sort of thing that brings Ragnarok about. So what happens to our maniacal trickster god? I say maniacal, but I don't think he was really. Alright, so we know from a poem called the Lokasina, which you are going to read a little bit of later in the term, that Loki shows up at a feast sometime after this, demanding to be seated. He has this blood oath with Odin, of course. That means Odin cannot drink unless Loki is offered drink too. So Odin says, fine, let him in. So the Lokasina is the flighting of Loki. And you're going to, as I said, read a little bit of it. Flighting is basically sort of verbal warfare. You insult the other person. And he insults each of the gods in turn, sometimes in quite ribald ways. He calls the male gods cowards. He suggests that they've disgraced themselves in various ways. Odin, for example, is using women's magic, which is wrong. He attacks the chastity of the goddesses. He basically calls them floozies, especially Freya and Sif. And Loki suggests that he's slept with a lot of them, including Sif, who is Thor's wife. This is how he gets a lock of her hair. Now, Loki only leaves when Thor shows up and threatens him because, and he says this, he knows that Thor will carry out his threat. So, scholars have different takes on the poem. Some think that it could be potentially a Christian critique of pagan deities, or perhaps a way of highlighting that the gods are not human and they could not be understood using human moral frameworks. It's really hard to say which is which, or whether there's something else we're not seeing here. The story continues with Loki making a run for it, hiding in the mountains, but they come after him and capture him. And as a captive, he does not have the rights he might have had he surrendered after negotiation. So he is chained to rocks. His sons are turned into wolves. One kills the other, and the guts of the dead son are used to bind him to the rock. A poisonous serpent is hung over his face, and his wife Sigyn stands by holding a basin to catch the poison, but anytime she has to turn away to empty it, the poison hits him and he screams and writhes, and his writhing causes earthquakes. So this is his final break with the Aesir. After this, he is their enemy, and he will lead the giants against them at Ragnarok. There is an inevitability here. He must bring about Baldur's death, he must insult the gods, or they wouldn't bind him, and he has to be bound in order to break free and take part in Ragnarok. Alright. So obviously the first sign that Ragnarok is coming is the Fimbulvinter, the Great Winter. So winter 3 times the length it should be, with no summer. And Ragnarok is also preceded by a period of social dislocation. Brother will fight brother and be his slayer. Sister's sons will violate the kinship bond, etc., from the seeress' prophecy. And then you get a number of cocks crowing, roosters, right? Don't let your minds go anywhere dirty. There is a red rooster that crows in the gallows wood. There is another rooster that crows in Ironwood, where a female troll is looking after Fenrir's children, Hati and Skoll, who are the wolves who will eat the sun and the moon. Now, Garmer, who is an interesting figure, he's sometimes described as a hellhound, but it's possible he's a double of Fenrir, will howl. Hadian's skull will swallow the sun and the moon. Yggdrasil will catch fire. Heimdall sounds the alarm by blowing his horn. The mountains shake and drive the dwarves from their homes. The Einherjar ride out, but the Bifrost Bridge breaks, and the warriors of Valhalla lose their horses in the river. So Odin's attempt to prepare for the final battle fails, which is really kind of ironic when you think about it. All right, the last part of the battle. By the way, that is a great piece of art of the Naglfar. I love that. Surtur, who's the fire giant, comes from the south with his blazing sword. The corpse ship Naglfari, or the Naglfar, which is made of dead men's nails, comes from the east, crewed by fire giants and steered by Loki. It is accompanied by Hyrmir, who is a frost giant leader. The world serpent is thrashing in the ocean. Fenrir is free and approaching. Fenrir swallows Odin, and the goddesses weep on the sidelines. Thor fights and kills the serpent, but takes 9 steps afterwards and dies of its poison. Now, Snorri adds a few additional details. Freyr fighting Surtur, Garmr killing Tyr, Heimdall and Loki killing each other. Vidar, Odin's son, kills Fenrir by ripping his jaws apart, but Surtur sets the world on fire and the land sinks into the sea. The stars vanish and the sun turns black. It's a very chaotic set of images. It's just, mutual destruction of both sides. Now, Christian tradition says that the end of the world marks the end of time. But in other mythologies, time is cyclical. When an old world is swept away, a new one rises to take its place. And this is what we see in Ragnarok. Ragnarok itself means doom of the gods, but Snorri actually doesn't call it that. He uses roker at the end of the word instead, which means dusk or glimmer in Ragnarokr. Hence, Wagner's translation of it as twilight of the gods, which has stuck with us, in English at least. The new world is very green. The Aesir who come back find each other. They find golden chess pieces in the grass. Hodr and Balder are reborn and reunite. And the Aesir reminisce about the old world. There are even new humans. Lif and Lithrasir somehow survive, hiding in a wood, and will repopulate their race. The sun gives birth to a new daughter. Gave birth to a new daughter before she was swallowed. Now, I keep talking about the new Aesir, so that's Vidar, Vali, Modi, and Magni. Other versions of the story don't actually talk about Hodr and Balder returning. Instead, they seem to emphasize that the old patterns will eventually reassert themselves. There will be more violence within the family. Everything is cyclical. And the last thing the seeress sees was Nidhogr, flying across the sky with corpses in its wings. That's a very ambiguous end to the prophecy, because what does it mean? Is Nidhogr clearing away the dead, or is this a sign of what's to come? So that is, little workmanlike summary of Ragnarok, which you all have either read or are reading for tutorial. Hopefully that will clarify any points that you're having difficulty with. Just remember there are variations from text to text, so not all of this is going to be in the version that you're reading. All right, I want to close out by talking about something related, which is kind of interesting, really. There's been the suggestion by a number of scholars lately that the story of Ragnarok can actually be linked to a number of specific geological or climatic events. The first of which was in the 6th century. So the 6th century sees some very strange weather. I mentioned this briefly at a couple of the tutorials just prior to Reading Week. But 536 CE and the year or two that followed apparently saw what's called a dust veil event, which was likely due to volcanic activity. So this is where the climate actually shifts due to the amount of ash in the atmosphere. Contemporary sources from the Mediterranean talk about a blue-colored sun that didn't shine properly, about yellow stuff that falls like snow, about unseasonable cold that caused crop failures. It's all very consistent with the effects of a major volcanic eruption, and it's supported by tree ring data and ice core evidence. Now, some scholars have also hypothesized that it could also be some type of cometary or meteorite impact, which is feasible, but it seems like it's a bit of a stretch when we can point to at least 2 volcanoes that went off in the immediate vicinity of that date. And certainly there was, whatever the cause, sustained cooling in the northern hemisphere until around 550 CE. And Scandinavian archaeology tells us that there were changes as a result in settlement patterns and cultural practices. So in Sweden, for instance, we know that they moved various rituals that used to be practiced outside to being practiced inside houses instead. Villages were abandoned and new ones were set up on higher ground. Agricultural production took a hit as well, from what we can tell, but that's a bit more speculative, to be fair. Now, we also see the building of new mounds in this period, and that would have needed substantial coordination of labor. So the question, of course, is what type of ritual process did they serve? Why did they appear all of a sudden in this period? There are even smaller details. So for instance, there's a strangely large number of gold pendants of a type that's been linked to sun worship that were deposited in what looks like some type of ritual fashion. There are certain types of common artifacts from prehistoric Scandinavia that suggest that sun worship was common. Were these offerings to try and get the weather conditions back to normal? Now, you can't date these types of things exactly, but certainly they do seem to be from sometime in the 6th century, the middle of the century. There's the concept of ritual failure, which is worth mentioning here. So if there is a perceived loss of effectiveness of old rituals, new rituals would be created. Now, the question, of course, is, did they actually inspire the Ragnarok story? It's impossible to tell. Again, no sources, plus there are other potential explanations, and frankly, the details of the Voluspa in particular don't always match what our sources from southern Europe say about the effects of the dust veil. So like a blue-colored sun is different from a fiery sky. And we do have to remember that in general, long, hard winters are kind of a thing in Scandinavia and in Iceland. And there are other potential parallels. We know that the Ragnarok story would have existed in some type of oral form, but we don't know what it looked like. We don't know how much of the story as we have it now was actually composed much closer to the time of the composition of the written version. So keep that in mind. The written version is something different from the oral version. The written version freezes something that is otherwise quite fluid, that can be told in different ways. An oral story is a collection of pieces that somebody performing it can reassemble it in countless different forms. But once you write it down, it's something that's fixed. You make decisions about what pieces you're going to put down in writing, in what order. So the Ragnarok from even the Poetic Edda is not the Ragnarok that existed in the oral tradition before the Poetic Edda was created. So the reason I bring this up is that we actually know there was a volcanic fissure in Iceland between 934 and 940 CE. It was very much like one we see in the late 18th century. So the 18th century version we have a lot of evidence for, and this eruption actually killed 20% of the Icelandic population and probably 100,000 people in Europe due to the resulting famine and the consequences of the ash pollution. The 10th century version of this, the Eldgjá eruption, was a 75-kilometer long fissure, and we know that the ash it emitted affected agricultural production as far away as the Middle East and China. This was possibly the reason why people stopped moving to Iceland all of a sudden around 930 CE. Now here's the most interesting suggestion. It's all inspiration for Ragnarok. I mean, the oral original might have preserved details from the 6th century, The written version carried those forward. It included additional details from the 10th century experience and synthesized something new. I mean, perhaps Ragnarok tells us a much more intricate story about the Scandinavian mindset than we realized, something that's based on centuries of historical experience. One scholar I was reading this past week even suggested that the story of Ragnarok is actually a climate fiction, which is a fascinating concept. All right, so that will do it for Ragnarok. I will be back with some discussion of our actual case study games. Thanks, guys.